Venezuela, a land that has become a stage for bloodshed, conflict and shattered dreams. From the resistance of indigenous tribes against Spanish conquerors to the wars of independence led by Simón Bolívar, through internal revolutions and economic collapses, this land has known no peace. Today, amidst its immense wealth and profound suffering, Venezuela stands at a crossroads, defying the past and determined to survive, despite all the storms that have battered it. Welcome to this new video in our series on the history of South American countries. The land of Venezuela was once inhabited by numerous indigenous peoples whose names and stories have been lost to time. Tribes such as the Arawak, Caribe, Temutoqueca, Warao, Pemon and Piaroa flourished across the coastal plains, river deltas and highland valleys long before the arrival of European ships. These peoples practiced hunting, farming and pottery, building distinctive cultural traditions, yet they left no written record of their civilizations. They came by ancient routes, settling along the winding banks of the Orinoco River and developing a life in harmony with the rhythms of the sun, rain and land. Languages were spoken and then silenced, stories told around fires and then faded with the dawn. There were no great empires with kings and written records, but rather communities living according to the logic of survival, hunting, farming, rituals, and the quiet beauty of the seasons. Had it not been for a monumental shift in world history, things might have continued as they were, isolated, natural, and far removed from the frantic events unfolding in Europe. Then everything changed. In the late 15th century, the silence was broken by the sound of oars and the appearance of massive wooden structures. Far from their homeland, strange new ships appeared on the horizon. When Christopher Columbus reached the mouth of the Orinoco River during his third voyage in 1498, he had no idea that he was on the cusp of a story that would rewrite history. The dense forests, waterways, and sprawling greenery captivated him, and he wrote with wonder and perhaps a touch of greed, unaware that this fascination would be the prelude to the destruction of the indigenous people. Years later, Amerigo Vespucci noticed houses built on wooden stilts on the shores of Lake Maracaibo. Recalling the canals of Venice, he named the area Venezuela, Little Venice, a name that stuck despite its stark differences from the Italian city. The irony is striking. A name rooted in comparison to a distant European city came to define a land far larger, more rugged, and more complex than that distant memory of water and wood. For a time, even the Europeans themselves called it by a different name under German influence, when the Welser banking family was granted colonization rights, leading to the establishment of settlements and expeditions in search of the legendary city of gold, El Dorado. But the golden dream yielded only disease, forests and resistance that claimed the lives of many explorers, unprepared for the scale of the land and the strength of its inhabitants. Did the indigenous people resist? Yes, bravely and fiercely. Leaders like Guaicaipuro and Tamanacu stood up to the Spanish incursions, and though ultimately subdued, their defiance echoed through the valleys and was immortalized in place names across the country. But Spanish weapons, horses, and epidemic diseases unknown in these lands ultimately tipped the scales, and forced conversions, broken alliances, and systematic conquest reshaped the social fabric. Founded in 1567, Caracas became a new political center, a seed of future power, and a symbol of a break in continuity. Under Spanish rule, the region became an integral part of the empire's extractive economy. tobacco, sugar and cocoa flowed out, while slavery and oppression became entrenched as social norms. Indigenous people were often treated no differently than enslaved Africans, forced to work in mines and plantations under harsh conditions. By the late 18th century, resentment in Spanish America had been simmering, exacerbated by the Bourbon reforms' consolidation of power and erosion of colonial autonomy, leading to sharp tensions. By the early 19th century, this pressure had erupted into open conflict. Then came the revolution. In 1810, Venezuelans took the bold step of declaring their independence from Spain. But the war was not a single event, but a series of battles, setbacks and resurgences. In 1812, the Caracas earthquake killed thousands, dealing a severe psychological blow to the fledgling republic. Amid this chaos, Simón Bolívar emerged as both a strategic leader and a symbol, embodying a new vision of liberation and unity that transcended local uprisings. He fought, retreated, regrouped, and with remarkable determination and audacity, drawing support from Haiti and British and Irish volunteers, turned the tide, much like Hannibal crossed the Alps centuries earlier. Venezuela experienced several short-lived republics, rising and falling under the pressure of Spanish royalist forces. The First Republic collapsed in 1812, forcing Bolívar to flee and rally support far from his homeland. Yet the struggle for freedom continued, culminating in decisive victories that ultimately led to the end of Spanish rule and the emergence of independent nations. Venezuela did not merely overthrow colonial rule. Bolívar's ambitions extended southward to liberate Colombia, Ecuador, Peru and Bolivia, forming what later became known as Gran Colombia. His dream was a unified Latin America, a collection of republics standing together against the old colonial powers. Though this dream faded, his influence on the continent's geopolitics remained indelible. Following the end of the wars of independence, Venezuela entered a new phase of internal conflict and political upheaval. The following years saw the rise of authoritarian conservative governments that ruled with an iron fist, and authoritarian liberal regimes that sought to modernize the state socially and economically. Attempts were made to abolish slavery and the death penalty, but economic mismanagement, mounting debt and infighting among political elites led to severe internal crises. Power struggles escalated into civil wars that claimed the lives of approximately 100,000 people, roughly 1/10 of the population at the time, all due to conflicts over power and laws, sometimes over trivial matters. Amidst this chaos, a man with an imposing beard emerged, serving as president 3 times during the 19th century. He initiated significant social reforms and oversaw the introduction of railways to Venezuela in 1883, connecting the country's various regions for the first time with a modern transportation infrastructure. However, his government was unstable. He faced internal conflicts and strained relations with European powers and the United States, and the country accumulated enormous foreign debt. When creditors demanded repayment, he openly declared that he would not pay, leading to a naval blockade imposed by Britain, Italy and Germany, and plunging the economy into a severe crisis. Following this crisis, the president was ousted by his vice president. But the greatest transformation was still on the horizon, the discovery of oil at the beginning of the 20th century. With the influx of foreign investment and the commencement of official exports in 1918, Venezuela's economy shifted from a traditional agrarian system to a rentier economy almost entirely dependent on oil. The country became one of the world's largest oil producers, and oil accounted for more than 90% of its imports. But Venezuela's heavy reliance on oil and failure to diversify its economy left it vulnerable to global price fluctuations, a situation that had negative repercussions in the following decades. In the mid-20th century, the country experienced a series of political transitions between military and civilian governments. Its first democratically elected president was elected in 1947, but he was overthrown in a coup a few months later, reflecting the fragility of the country's political institutions at the time. The following year, Venezuela became a founding member of OPEC, granting it a pivotal role in the global oil market, but also deepening its dependence on a single resource. During the global oil crisis of the 1970s, Venezuela reaped enormous profits, which it spent on development and social projects. However, by the 1980s, recession was looming, and the country's vulnerability to near-total dependence on oil and the dollar was exposed. With the first sharp drop in prices, inflation soared, the currency plummeted, and public anger and protests erupted. From the heart of this social unrest, Hugo Chávez emerged in the late 1990s as a populist leader promising radical change and the establishment of what he called Bolivarian socialism. He initially appeared successful in alleviating poverty and expanding social services thanks to oil, but he pursued policies of nationalizing the oil industry, weakening state institutions and restricting the private sector, which fostered corruption and a decline in economic efficiency over time. Although the president appeared outwardly happy, surrounded by oil revenues and grand pronouncements of prosperity, the reality was far grimmer. Excessive borrowing, near-total dependence on oil, and a heavy reliance on the US dollar were all contributing factors to the fragility of the economy and the decline in citizens' purchasing power, to the point where any external shock seemed capable of igniting a full-blown crisis. As riots and popular protests erupted, Hugo Chávez capitalized on the wave of public discontent and disillusionment, seizing power through a skillfully populist approach that promised radical change and social justice. A left-wing populist, Chávez used emotional rhetoric and social promises to win the support of millions of Venezuelans. He began implementing ambitious policies on paper, extensive social programs, subsidies for education and healthcare, the nationalization of oil companies and vital utilities, and the redistribution of resources. Despite the apparent success in reducing poverty for a time, these policies ultimately devastated the economy. Corruption became rampant, institutions were weakened, and political loyalty was prioritized over professional competence, leaving the state unable to cope with crises. When Chávez died in 2013, Nicolás Maduro assumed power, a man without Chávez's charisma, but one who inherited a heavy political and economic burden. Despite his distinctive moustache and constant populist rhetoric, Maduro failed to address the financial crisis, which continued to worsen with the collapse of oil prices, soaring inflation, and the devaluation of the local currency. This left citizens with virtually no purchasing power, and basic necessities became luxuries beyond the reach of most Venezuelans. Yet, amidst widespread protests and a mass exodus that saw millions of Venezuelans flee the country, Maduro continued to win elections, despite widespread accusations of electoral fraud and the repression of the opposition. This cycle of continued rule in the face of popular opposition reveals the resilience of the regime against the fragility of the state and underscores the extent of the country's structural challenges. A 2024 United Nations report revealed that over 80% of Venezuela's population lives below the poverty line, a shocking figure compared to just a few decades ago when the country was one of Latin America's wealthiest thanks to its vast oil reserves. Meanwhile, Venezuela faces soaring crime rates, failing health and education services, and crumbling basic infrastructure, making daily life for most of its citizens unprecedentedly difficult and complex. Then, at the beginning of 2026, an extraordinary event occurred in the annals of the Americas' political history. On January 3rd, under the cover of night in Caracas, the era of Nicolás Maduro came to an end in a swift military operation known as Operation Infinite Resolve. The man who had ruled Venezuela with an iron fist for over a decade was taken in chains to the United States, where, in February of this year, he stood behind bars in New York City, awaiting a historic trial scheduled for March 26th. However, Maduro's downfall was but one chapter in the story of a nation burdened with wounds. Today, at this juncture in 2026, Venezuela stands before the mirror of its history. A country possessing the largest energy reserves on the planet, yet experiencing a complex existential crisis. It is a land of contradictions, immense wealth juxtaposed with a crippled economy, humanitarian services that have dwindled to almost nothing, infrastructure that has crumbled under the storms of neglect, and a people burdened by poverty, mercilessly exacerbated by conflict. This complex phase is not a product of the moment, but rather the bitter fruit of a long and arduous history. From excessive dependence on its black gold to civil wars and international conflicts that have turned its soil into an arena for settling major scores. Venezuela is not a country that stumbled due to a single factor, but a region steeped in history where the timeless question is being tested. Can a nation shake off the dust of defeat after decades of wandering? And can a homeland regain its sovereignty and equilibrium when tossed about by the waves of volatile foreign policies? The answer, as history has taught us, remains an enigma, its secrets to be unlocked only by time. But it remains suspended on the horizon of Caracas, awaiting a firm national will and decisive decisions to pull Venezuela out of the rubble of crises, to begin writing a new chapter worthy of its great history and the glories of its early liberators. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.